The Shapeshifting Killer, a psychological horror story. Sheriff Mason lived in a small, quiet town. He seemed like a normal man, doing his job every day. But deep inside, he carried a heavy sadness. Many years ago, his daughter went missing, and no one ever found out what happened to her. This made Mason feel like a part of him was lost forever. In the town, there were old stories that people used to tell. These stories were about a creature that could change its shape, becoming anyone or anything. Mason's grandmother told him these stories when he was a child. Most people thought these stories were just silly tales, but Mason never forgot them. One day, strange things started happening in the town. People were found dead, and no one knew who did it. The bodies were left in terrible ways, and everyone was scared. Mason knew it was his job to find the person who was doing these terrible things. But as he started looking into the murders, something felt familiar to him. It reminded him of the stories his grandmother told him long ago. Mason became determined to catch the killer. He felt that maybe, just maybe, this would help him find out what happened to his daughter too. But as he got deeper into the case, he realized that this was not a normal killer. Something dark was happening in the town, and it was connected to the old stories he heard as a child. Deputy Sarah was new to the town. She was young, smart, and very curious. She wanted to prove herself. So she started helping Sheriff Mason with the case, but soon she noticed something strange about Mason. He seemed too focused, almost like he was hiding something. Sarah decided to investigate Mason quietly. She started looking into his past, finding out about his missing daughter. The more she learned, the more she thought that Mason knew more about the murders than he was telling. She wondered if he was connected to the killer somehow. As Sarah got closer to the truth, Mason began to notice. He could see that Sarah was watching him, asking questions, trying to figure him out. Mason didn't want anyone to know about his own secret investigation, so he tried to act normal. But it was hard. Every time Sarah asked a question, Mason felt like he was in more danger of being caught. Mason tried to keep Sarah away from his secrets. He didn't want her to find out about the old stories or what he really believed about the murders. But the more he tried to hide, the more Sarah became suspicious. She was getting too close, and Mason knew he had to be careful. Sheriff Mason knew he had to be careful. Deputy Sarah was getting too close to the truth. She was asking more and more questions, and Mason felt trapped. He didn't want her to find out what he was really doing. Mason started to act like everything was normal. He tried to smile more, to make it seem like he wasn't worried. He even started to share some information with Sarah, hoping she would stop being so suspicious. But inside, he was very nervous. At night, Mason would go out alone, searching for clues about the killer. He went to the old woods, where the stories said the creature might live. He didn't tell anyone, not even Sarah, about what he was doing. But every time he thought he was getting close, something would go wrong. It was like the killer was always one step ahead of him. Mason was careful not to leave any clues behind, but it was hard. The more he tried to hide what he was doing, the more it seemed like Sarah was watching him. She was smart, and Mason knew she wouldn't give up easily. One day, Sarah asked Mason to join her on a patrol. She said it was just to check the area, but Mason felt like it was a test. He didn't want to go, but he couldn't say no. During the patrol, Mason tried to stay calm, but he could see Sarah was studying him, looking for any sign that he was hiding something. Mason knew he had to be even more careful now. He couldn't let Sarah find out what he was doing. But every move he made seemed to bring him closer to being discovered. Deputy Sarah knew something wasn't right with Sheriff Mason. She decided to set a trap to find out what he was hiding. She came up with a plan. Sarah told Mason that they had a new lead on the killer. She said they found something important in an old cabin near the woods. But this wasn't true. Sarah just wanted to see how Mason would react. She wanted to catch him off guard. Mason's heart raced when he heard about the cabin. He knew the area well. It was close to where the stories said the shapeshifter might be. But Mason also knew there was no way Sarah could have found something without him knowing. He realized this might be a trick, but he couldn't ignore it. Sarah watched Mason closely when she told him about the cabin. She noticed how his eyes widened for just a moment, and how he quickly tried to hide his surprise. This made Sarah even more certain that Mason knew something he wasn't telling her. Mason had no choice but to go to the cabin with Sarah. As they walked through the woods, Mason tried to think of a way to avoid falling into her trap. He needed to keep his secrets safe, but he also needed to see if there was really something new at the cabin. When they arrived, the cabin was empty, just as Mason expected. But Sarah didn't care about the cabin. She was more interested in Mason's behavior. She asked him questions, trying to get him to slip up, to say something that would reveal what he was hiding. Mason kept his answers short, careful not to give anything away. He knew this was a test, and he couldn't let Sarah win. But as they left the cabin, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking deeper into a trap he couldn't escape. Sheriff Mason knew that Sarah was closing in on him. She was getting too close to the truth, and he needed to act fast. He decided to take control of the situation. Mason started to gather information about Sarah. He needed to know what she knew, what she was planning. He began asking other deputies about her, trying to find out if she had shared her suspicions with anyone else. Mason wanted to stay one step ahead. He also started to create false leads in the investigation. He left behind clues that pointed to other suspects. Hoping to distract Sarah and buy himself more time, Mason knew he had to be careful, but he was determined to protect his secrets, no matter what. Meanwhile, Sarah noticed that the investigation was getting more complicated. There were new clues, but they didn't make sense. It was as if someone was trying to confuse her. Sarah became more determined to find out what Mason was hiding. Mason could feel the pressure building. Every move he made seemed to lead to another dead end. He couldn't tell if Sarah was falling for his tricks or getting even closer to the truth. The real killer was still out there, and Mason was running out of time to catch them before Sarah exposed him. One night, Mason decided to confront Sarah. He invited her to his office, pretending he wanted to discuss the case. But his real plan was to see how much she knew and to try to throw her off the trail. During their conversation, Mason tried to steer the discussion away from anything that could reveal his secrets. He asked Sarah about her thoughts on the case, hoping to find out what she suspected. But Sarah was careful too. She knew Mason was trying to figure her out, so she kept her answers vague. As the night went on, both Mason and Sarah realized they were playing a dangerous game. Each of them was trying to outsmart the other, but neither of them knew how it would end. Just when things couldn't get more complicated, a stranger came to town. His name was Mr. Black, and he said he was an expert in old legends and folklore. He claimed he knew about the shapeshifter stories that were told in the town. Mr. Black went straight to Sheriff Mason and offered to help with the case. He said that the murders might be connected to the old legends, and that he could help Mason understand what was really going on. Mason didn't trust Mr. Black, but he was curious. How did this stranger know so much? Sarah, too, was suspicious of Mr. Black. She thought it was strange that he showed up just when the investigation was getting intense. But Mr. Black seemed to know things that no one else did, things that only the killer should know. Mr. Black started telling Mason and Sarah about the shapeshifter. He said that the creature could change into anyone, even someone you know and trust. This made everyone in town nervous. Who could they trust if the killer could be anyone? Mason didn't know what to think. Was Mr. Black telling the truth, or was he part of the killer's plan? The more Mr. Black talked, the more confused Mason and Sarah became. It was like the rules of the game had changed, and they didn't know who was in control anymore. Mr. Black then suggested a plan. He said they needed to find a special place in the woods where the shapeshifter might be hiding. Mason agreed to go with him, but Sarah wasn't sure. She felt like they were walking into a trap, but she didn't know how to stop it. As they prepared to go into the woods, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The stranger's arrival had changed everything, and now Mason and Sarah were more uncertain than ever. Sheriff Mason, Deputy Sarah, and Mr. Black made their way into the dark woods. The air was thick with tension. Mason's heart pounded as they walked deeper into the forest. He knew this was it, the moment when everything would be revealed. They finally reached the place Mr. Black had talked about. It was a clearing surrounded by tall, old trees. The moonlight made strange shadows on the ground, and the air felt cold and heavy. Mr. Black stood in the center of the clearing. He began to speak in a low voice, telling Mason and Sarah that this was where the shapeshifter would reveal itself. Mason didn't know whether to trust him, but he had come too far to turn back now. Suddenly, there was a rustling in the bushes. Mason and Sarah turned quickly, their hands on their weapons. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It looked like a person, but there was something wrong, something unnatural about it. The figure slowly changed shape right before their eyes. It turned into someone they both recognized, Mason's missing daughter. Mason froze, unable to believe what he was seeing. Could it really be her? But before he could react, the figure changed again, this time into the shape of Mason himself. It was the shapeshifter, and it was showing them that it could be anyone, even Mason. Mason and Sarah pointed their guns at the shapeshifter, but it was hard to know what to do. If they shot, would it even work? The shapeshifter smiled, as if it knew their fear. Mr. Black then revealed something shocking. He had known the shapeshifter all along. In fact, he had come to the town to help the creature finish its work. Mason and Sarah realized they had been led into a trap. And now they were face to face with both the shapeshifter and Mr. Black, who was not an ally after all. The shapeshifter lunged at Mason, and a fierce struggle began. Mason fought with everything he had, knowing that this was the final battle. Sarah joined in, trying to help Mason, but the shapeshifter was strong and fast, constantly changing form to confuse them. In the middle of the fight, Mason looked into the eyes of the shapeshifter. For a moment, he thought he saw his daughter's eyes looking back at him, filled with sadness. It made him hesitate, just for a second. As Sheriff Mason hesitated, the shapeshifter took advantage of the moment. It knocked Mason to the ground, and he struggled to get back up. The creature was too strong, and Mason knew he couldn't fight it alone. Deputy Sarah saw what was happening. She realized that Mason was in grave danger, and she had to make a choice. She could try to save him, or she could go after Mr. Black, who was watching the fight with a cold smile. Sarah made her decision quickly. She ran toward Mason and the shapeshifter, knowing that she might not survive. She had to do something to stop the creature, even if it meant risking her own life. With a shout, Sarah threw herself at the shapeshifter. The creature turned its attention to her. And in that moment, Mason saw his chance. He grabbed his gun and fired, aiming at the shapeshifter's heart. The creature let out a terrible scream and began to change shape rapidly, becoming a blur of different faces and forms. But Sarah had weakened it, and Mason's shot hit its mark. The shapeshifter collapsed, its body twisting and changing until it became nothing but a dark shadow on the ground. It was over, but the victory came at a price. Sarah lay on the ground, badly hurt from the fight. Mason rushed to her side, but he could see that she was fading fast. Sarah looked up at Mason with a faint smile, knowing that she had saved him, but at the cost of her own life. Mason held Sarah's hand as she took her last breath. The forest was silent now, the threat of the shapeshifter gone, but the loss of Sarah weighed heavily on Mason's heart. He had won the fight, but it had cost him someone he cared about. The sacrifice had been made, and Mason knew he would never forget what Sarah had done for him. Sheriff Mason buried Sarah in the small town's graveyard. Everyone came to the funeral, and they all said she was a hero, but Mason felt empty inside. He had lost too much. After the funeral, Mason returned to his office. He sat at his desk, staring at the map of the town on the wall. The shapeshifter was gone, and Mr. Black had disappeared into the night, but something still didn't feel right. Mason thought about the shapeshifter's eyes when it took the form of his daughter. Was it really his daughter for a moment? Or was it just another trick? He couldn't stop thinking about it. The doubt gnawed at him, making it hard to sleep at night. One evening, as Mason was leaving the office, he noticed something strange. A shadow moved quickly across the street. Almost too fast to see, he stopped and looked around, but nothing was there. Mason shook his head, telling himself it was just his imagination, but deep down, he couldn't be sure. What if the shapeshifter wasn't really gone? What if it had survived somehow? As Mason walked home, he felt a cold breeze on the back of his neck. He turned around quickly. But again, there was nothing. The town was quiet, too quiet. When Mason reached his house, he hesitated before opening the door. He glanced around one last time, feeling like something was watching him from the darkness. He went inside, closed the door, and locked it. But even in the safety of his own home, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't truly over. The shapeshifter could still be out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Mason sat in his chair, staring into the dark corners of the room. The thought haunted him. Had he really won, or was the nightmare just beginning? The answer was something only time would reveal.